presenters up, and then this is your time really to ask any questions or interact if you have any things that you want to bring up. This is a great time. Yeah. Jim.
Monty, you're mentioning that the importance of doing first narrative versus third narrative and doing health communication. I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that and why it is more that much more effective than third person.
Well, that's not a general across the board rule, but there are times when, well, it actually gets back to the answer that I wish I'd given to somebody's earlier question, your earlier question about which of the four of those always gets shorted. And it just has to do with the emotional connection. And in fact, I thought about that so much looking at your artwork just now. I mean, I could have sat there and written, what I think is the most brilliant, cadenza for somebody to speak at some high point of a movie. But you did it with, with lines and with expressions. And there are often times when you're on the set and you realize that there's an unnecessary line, and because the actor can sell it with a look, or you can do it with a camera move, or you can do it completely visual with no words at all. But there are times when people just telling their own stories, there's no other way to duplicate it. And when, somebody will see a documentary maybe that you're hoping will work as a piece of propaganda, where you're trying to get them to not be so judgmental next time they meet a Muslim, or to use a condom next time they have sex, or to, any kind of, anything that you want to get a result out of. There's just something about somebody telling his or her own story that you cannot duplicate any other way. And sometimes it doesn't matter how badly expressed it is, or maybe if it's redundant or they left something out. If you can develop your sense of what's working, and you can choose that bite, I don't think anything else can top it.
And you asked us to kind of imagine the process of working with individuals like this, and we've got a real live example here in that you've been working with them, and I'm wondering if any of you have some examples of when Vic first pitched this story. What was your reaction? Were there some big reactions about, oh my God, not that? Or no, you can't go that direction. It's got to be this. Some sort of important contributions that you've made to his initial idea.
Well, I could speak from my own experience. One of the things I talked about with style, where I try to adapt stylistically, I also do it with the way I work, the method in which I work, because, and this is, I didn't mention this up there, but this is very unusual in that when I get scripts from Vic, they're in a spreadsheet, which I've never seen before. And rather than say, Vic, could you please write it in script format, there was no reason to do that, because the idea was there, the panel description was there, the dialogue was there, everything I needed was there. So I just adapted to the way he works. And a lot of writers, especially in comics, they're so busy, they're sort of hands-off when the artwork starts. They write the script, turn it in. They don't have time to deal with me because they're writing the next script, because it's a monthly cycle. It's incredibly fast-paced. So they might do a rewrite or a tweak, or maybe can we redraw this one panel after everything's turned in, but it's rarely a back-and-forth collaboration. Punks would be the only exception to that previous to Vic, where it is back and forth because we both own the property versus hired as a job. Whereas Vic's process is he enjoys being involved. He enjoys being hands-on because he's passionate about it. And so I feed off that passion in the art. So we'll get on the phone and talk about pages I just turned in, or we'll swap emails, all day long about this or that. And to me, that's been very rewarding, because a lot of times, if I'm writing my own story, I control the destiny of that story. If I'm working with a writer, my goal is to try and capture their vision. Otherwise, I'll write my own story. If I'm working with a writer, I want to get in their head and explore what they were thinking, why they did what they did. And a lot of times, it's just not there. And so a lot of times, a project I'm drawing seems very empty, or very, there's no passion behind it. It's just a job, right? Because that connection's not there. But with Vic, we're on the phone, we're talking, we're communicating. He actually comes in, we sit at the cafe and go through all the pages and make notes. And that's been very rewarding for me, because it's not crawfish heads, that's right. Because, and boudin, right? Suck down some boudin.
I'd like to add a little bit to that. That's a great question, by the way. It's helping Vic with this book has been very easy for me because I've known him for so long. And I think that all three of us would agree that telling your own story, even if just because you have an interesting story, doesn't necessarily mean you can tell it. You might need some help from somebody else. And so when I would read early drafts of the book of a single line of dialogue, and I think that doesn't sound like you, because when you're writing your, you can't see your own, your reflection in the mirror does not look the same as you look to somebody else. And sometimes you would sound like yourself, and sometimes you wouldn't. And an interesting thing about the voice in the book when you read it will be that Vic in front of a class is, talks one certain way, and then Vic at home talks another way, and then Vic's interior monologue is a third thing. Well, I don't think that was as apparent to you because you're inside it all the time as it was to me. Now that's an easy process for me because all I have to do is compare the Vic in the book to the one that I know. Now Mike has a much harder job because you have to do exactly the same thing with somebody that you might have met 5 minutes ago. How do you help somebody tell his or her story that you've just met?
I think it goes back to a question that was asked earlier, which is it basically always boils down to assessing your audience and being in tune with their objective and not your own objective. And I think when you're listening, I mean, I used to do this thing at the university. The med school would hire actors to play patients for the medical students, and I would have as a patient an objective, and it was really sort of interesting to see which doctors I would never go to because of the way that they would feel that they would want to lead the discussion. But I think it's more about listening than it is about talking.
What were some of the diseases you had to do?
Oh, I was.
Tell me later.
Getting back to Ed's question, I want to say we're looking at a new project with Walter Reed Hospital of veterans who've come back and they've been pretty much a lot of severely disabled and many multiple amputees, and they have trauma, all of them. And one of the things we've discovered is that they all have a narrative. They have a story inside that almost has to come out. It's really interesting when you talk to these people. And so we're talking right now together about aligning vets with comic book artists. And those comic book artists will have totally different styles. One might be somebody who does like samurai warriors and may want to convey the story as an ancient samurai warrior. Another could be with little birds and sketch drawings. Another could be more like what Cody is doing. And each of those will be different, but we also realize that you need a storyteller with that because, as you say, not everybody is like a great storyteller, and so Monty, in a way, is a midwife of that story, pulling it out and linking that person with a comic artist, and then putting that into a book called Trauma Narratives or something, related to trauma narrative with maybe 12 different veterans designed to convey this story, we think will be exciting. But one of the things that I realize is that I don't have those talents, but maybe I can produce it and put the right pieces of the puzzle together, and that, I think, is an important piece. Yeah?
So first, thanks for doing this, because I thought it was amazing and inspiring, and the first three things, engaging and understandable and memorable. And I wanted to ask all of you a little bit about the actionable piece, right? So sitting here for 2 hours, it's like, yeah, I want to do that. Let's do that. And then I'm thinking, but you said that it takes, a day per page or this large amount of time that I'm guessing means a part of your livelihood, right? And you made this kind of comment about doing things kind of for charity or for, the bread and butter of what you do. And so I wondered if you guys could just talk a little bit about, so all of us are sitting in the room, public health typically is less well-funded, like the things that we're rewarded for are different, like how do you do this, right?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I've discovered is a lot of artists are unemployed during a piece of time, especially artists. So you talk to folks and, these guys all know being unemployed as well as knowing other people who are unemployed for a lot of pieces of their time. Monty, for example, may sell a script and make enough money for a year and then can sit back and then so I can call him and he's ready to do some work. Almost every artist I've ever met, oddly enough, wants to do good things. They may be tired of working, selling X, cigarettes or whatever, with a new logo, but they want to do something that's meaningful. So I found it very easy, quite honestly, to connect with artists. But I'd like you guys to talk about that.
Well,
we all just signed with Vic's agency, by the way, just now. So.
My question is, what do you want to do? Before you ask yourself, how are you going to do it, what do you want to do? I'm asking, yeah.
So, there are a couple things that sort of come to mind, but one thing that I've been thinking about actually since seeing some of the slides from Vic's book is just what an incredible device that is for teaching, right? And so I've been thinking about, in my own teaching, it sucks standing up in front of 300 kids and having them feel like they have to be there instead of feeling inspired, right? And so if I could work with a comic book artist on the slides for our introductory lectures, right, then maybe they would all go out and do more powerful things than they're going to do feeling like the intro lectures for. So that's, one flavor of something that one might want to do, that I would like to do. Another kind of flavor of those kinds of things would be, when I think about the projects that we do, we have wonderful support, like Holly has helped us a lot in making messages for some of the work that we've done trying to get people to be more physically active. But we're working around certain kinds of constraints. I do neuroscience research trying to predict health behavior change. And so if we could sort of...
What's that? What is it?
brain stuff, trying to make better health communications, but like trying to figure out how to actually, Vic has been actually involved a lot in saying, let's not just take things that are really tightly controlled, but can we get something that really works, right? And so I feel like often it's me and a grad student pulling clip art from the internet with some technical expertise, but maybe we're not comparing the most effective thing to a control. Maybe we're comparing like the most effective thing that we can come up with. But so I mean, there's a whole big list, and I don't want to take everybody's time on it. But there's sort of a range of things that I could imagine. And I guess I was just trying to think through, like, what would this look like? Would I call a friend from LA and say, like, hey, you're a scriptwriter, like, want to work on a project with me? Or would it be like, I need a grant, like...
Well, I also think, I don't know necessarily that you need to waste the minutes on calling LA. The university has an amazing film department, has an amazing art department. I think there are ways in which I would go to those departments and say, I could use a little help doing this, and you might find that you make a friend who has a similar connection. But I think ultimately, what I'm hearing you say is that you have great ideas. Now, how do you implement those ideas? And I think that's where most people stop doing or don't start doing because they're like feel that that's such a burden or it's so heavy. But I think it's like you said, to keep it simple.
Yeah. One of my tricks to meeting people and getting myself in positions where I can do things. It's a bigger part of my presentation, but when I meet people, I like to ask what they do or what they're working on. And that seems very simple at first, but it's very powerful for networking because they basically open themselves up to you, tell you what fields are working and what specialties they do. And by the time it's all said and done, if you have a service that you can provide that matches up with that, that's a great time to tell them. And now that you know your entry point to that. So when I do a lot of Comic-Cons and things like that, but one of the keys, I think, is whatever it is you want to do, whatever it is you're trying to do or you're going to attempt to do, immerse yourself in that a little bit first before you start trying to connect with people to make projects. So like Vic, I don't know how long you spent poking around on Google and talking to artists and editors at comic shops. And he immersed himself in the comics world first, and then he started finding artists and then reached out to artists. So
crazy-ass people, too. I'm going to try to move this. I think this is a great conversation maybe to carry on just after this, and you can talk to them about that. Just a couple more questions. We're running out of time.
So I was just wondering, when you're working on a personal project, say something that doesn't have a deadline or there's no pressure from an outside source, how do you keep yourself motivated to see it through completion? Or how do you work in an efficient manner in those types of situations? Because I feel like it'd be pretty easy to start something and maybe not completely see it through or take more time than you would need to complete the project.
My mortgage bank sort of takes care of that for me.
What I do is I overcommit. That's my secret.
Overcommit?
Yeah, here's an example. Here's an example. I'm writing a new script right now for a new comic series, and I have representation in Hollywood, so I go do meetings and I show it. I scheduled my meetings before the outline's ready. So that's my deadline. I force deadlines on myself by scheduling meetings is what I do. And if I don't do that, I'll poke at the same outline for 4 years and it's still not going to get done.
How about you, Mike?
You know, for me, I was just thinking in my head about what you said, like, because there's often times where I'm like, oh my God, this would be a really great show. I'm going to write a treatment for this show, and you know, I sit down and I'm all gung ho in the moment, and then the phone rings, and then I got to go to Facebook, and then I got to go to my job, and you know, and so I think ultimately, like, it's those that we all have these sort of ideas that are sort of fleeting, but it's when it's that idea that sticks and that you can't stop thinking about. And there are often times where I'll be directing a show. I direct a lot of musicals, and I will ignore a section. I mean, ultimately, that's not a great example because I do have a deadline because the show has to open, so never mind. But
so you've overcommitted is what you're telling me.
Yeah.
The show's not ready and you got to start
I
it.
think all artists overcommit. I think that's you have to. But I think essentially it comes from passion. Like, it comes from really wanting to tell the story, feeling like the story needs to be heard, that the message that you're trying to create has to get to a larger audience. And for me, that's what it's all about. It's feeling very passionate about that work.
We have time for one more. Yeah, in the back.
Well, I'm a doctor, and unfortunately I missed the first presentation, but one thing that's really bothering me is the myths that are perpetuated in healthcare. One of the current ones being that anyone who's 2 pounds overweight or more is responsible for all of the problems in the healthcare system. It's a strategy of blaming the victims, and I really think it's causing a lot of people to be depressed about it and obsessions with it and all that. So I've been trying to think of ways of countering that kind of propaganda using art. So I just wondered if you addressed those, if you have any ideas about that.
Yeah, that sets up a perfect answer to your earlier question, which is how can you guys, you know, sort of do what we do to make your work better and more effective. And what it is you just, whenever you think of, there's an idea that you want to communicate to a lot of people. And the first thing to ask yourself is there a story in this? So instead of taking on the world, think of one person who has got this particular problem, and then you think, how can I weave a tale around this thing? A quick example is, I read one time a couple of years ago that in Latino cultures, people are reluctant to give blood. And rather than trying to think of taking on the entire, you know, Spanish-speaking world, I thought, like, what if there was like a lucha libre wrestler who was the world's worst wrestler, but he was an incredible blood donor. He could just squeeze off a pint whenever he wanted, you know. And so the gigantic lucha libre wrestler, you know, he completely shuts this guy down by being a better blood donor when the other guy faints. Now, that's a very primitive story, but, you know, you start right on from the story side, not from the mass communication side. Because if the story's good, you can blow it up and you can scale it across anybody that wants to read it in a comic book or see it in a movie or a little website or a radio player or whatever. So you should always be asking yourself, is there a story in this?
Great. One more question. Yes, in the back.
I have a question for Cody. So you hand draw everything. How do you get that into your computer, I'm assuming, to do the digital coloring?
It's just a scanner. Yeah, I have a large, there's different kinds, cheaper ones, but I have an expensive large format that allows me to do up to 12 by 18 inches. So I just lay the page on the scanner, and you know, there's different quality settings for different types of artwork, but after a while you get used to your the way you need to scan it. And then I open it in Photoshop. I mostly use Photoshop for coloring and revisions. Pretty standard.
Do you know if that's what they use for that like collage style?
You can scan. A lot of times if it's got depth, you have to photograph it. Because what happened with the scanner is it'll create weird shadows in places. So with photographs, what you'll see is like a lighting grid where they'll position light specifically to kill certain shadows. And if they're photographing something very deep, a very deep sculpture or something like that, if you happen to be on a set when they're doing it, which I have, you'll see lights in the weirdest places or bouncing off of stuff. And so it's all about controlling the shadowing. And then they'll take a very high resolution photo. Sometimes they'll shoot analog slides and then laser scan the slide versus shooting digital. But digital is getting to the point now where you can really capture big images.
With that, first of all, I really want to thank all of you for being here. I really would love to encourage you to start working with artists who, you know, there's this top group of artists who are always in demand and they're very expensive, and we often think of artists that way, but there's this gigantic group underneath that who are also very, very talented and are looking to work with people like us. And maybe afterwards you can contact these folks or talk to them in person and find out just, you know, what those networks are. There are a couple of questions related to that that I think are
Can I
relevant.
say something on finding
Please
artists
do.
very quickly? Just a quick point. For the most part, and this is, I say this broadly because I talk to so many artists in the comic industry, but for the most part, universities tend to frown on commercial art. It's a fine art world in the university system, and that's great, and we need fine art. Commercial art is usually ignored, brushed aside, or it becomes a very minor part of art school. However, a very large majority of artists in those schools have an interest in commercial art. And I think the best route to get to them is if there's an illustration curriculum, approach that instructor, and they'll recommend artists. And if there's a graphic design instructor, approach that instructor, and they'll recommend artists. Because they always know, they know their students, and they know who's doing what, who's interested in what. But if you basically walk out and try to find it in the galleries and stuff, you're not going to see it. You have to sort of find a back door to finding the commercial artists in art school.
The University of Michigan School of Art and Design has a comic book art class.
Perfect.
So student projects.
And the other thing I found is that artists, like journalists, are really used to deadlines. They understand them at least as well as we do. They have to, you know, Mike has to produce a musical that actually has to go on stage next week, you know, or whatever. So they're used to getting, fulfilling deadlines, used to extraordinarily hard work, and listening to you. So I really encourage this. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for